Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland Sunday Morning Community Forum. Today we have a very exciting presentation on the Frank Talk on the protest movement. And to give you a full introduction, I'm going to immediately turn it over to Laura Imbornoni to start us off. Laura?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Protests across the United States in the aftermath of George Floyd's death have been both troubling and inspiring. How effective are they to change systemic racism and to initiate real systemic change? Is protest an integral part of the texture of American politics? Let's look back. Let's go back a couple of years to the March of Our Lives for Gun Control in 2018. The March for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Equal Rights, 1993. Back further, the anti-war protests in Washington, D.C. in 1969. The March on Washington in 1963 with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and many, many more throughout the time our country has been alive, all the way back to the Boston Tea Party. We have three wonderful speakers today. Our first speaker, Richard Perloff, completed his PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison and a postdoctoral fellowship in social psychology and communication at Ohio State University. The author of academic textbooks on persuasion and political communication, he holds a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science at Cleveland State University. According to his CSU profile, Professor Perloff enjoys teaching immensely and is known as an enthusiastic, energetic professor. He served as chair and founding director of the School of Communication from 2003 to 2011. The second speaker is Melekte Melaku, and she's an organizing strategist for ACLU in Cleveland. After graduating in political science from Case Western University in Cleveland, Melekte devoted a year serving with the educational nonprofit City Year. There, she provided individual group coursework interventions, socio-emotional coaching, and coordinated programming for a multidisciplinary arts after-school curriculum at Glenville High School. She's done political consulting and organizing work on behalf of issues related to environmental justice, mass incarceration, voter rights, and access to quality education. She's a former Obama for America Fellow and is writer, producer, and director of the ACLU of Ohio Bail Reform Podcast, The Steep Road to Freedom. Melekte is leading a local campaign now to eliminate the cost of pretrial electronic monitoring devices and advance bail reforms locally here in Cuyahoga County. Rachael Collyer, our third speaker, is an organizer and program director of the Ohio Student Association. Here's how that organization describes itself in one article. Ohio Student Association is a statewide organization led by young people in Ohio working together in an intergenerational movement for racial, social, economic, and educational justice. Our leaders are between 18 and 24 years old. 18 and 35 years old. Some of us are not students, some creatives and art activists. Others are high school students, college students, graduates, and graduate students. We organize young people in order to build independent political power. In 2015, Rachael graduated summa cum laude from Ohio State University. And now back to Richard Perloff, who'll speak first today. He wrote a Cleveland.com article about the Kent State shootings in May of this year during that anniversary time. He recently won the Press Club of Cleveland Best in Ohio Essay Writing Award at its recent All Ohio Excellence in Journalism Awards event. We're so glad to have you with us today, Professor Perloff, and please begin our forum.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Laura. I want to start with a historic memory here, which is for some, as I think back on it, it's the numbers 4, 13, and 67, 4, the number of students killed on that ghastly afternoon, 13, the number of seconds that Ohio National Guard fired into the crowd, and 67, the number of seconds that 67, the round of ammunition fired on May 4th, 1970. For me, it's the pictures, always has been, the youth in the eyes, the hope, sweetness, innocence of Alison Krauss, Jeff Miller, Sandy Scheuer, and Bill Schroeder, who were killed 50 years ago this spring. I was 18 years old when the May 4th events occurred, a student reporter from Michigan Daily in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Several days after they were killed, I drove down to Kent and witnessed a veritable ghost town. University Guardsmen, a girl standing at a sorority, just a shocked expression on her face. The place was deserted. And it's a sight I still recall many years later. You know, it was a melee. The protesters were faced with a melee. They were organizing to protect their free speech. Their rally had been canceled. They felt that the guard should not be on campus. And even though the epithets they hurled posed no threat, they were shot at 12:24 p.m. on May 4th. But you know, as the Scranton Commission unrest famously contended, the guards were facing a danger. It was not a danger that called for lethal force. And I've studied this over the years. In 2010, I wrote a piece for C Magazine that interviewed maybe a dozen people on the whole thing. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, with a plain dealer on it. I've really immersed myself in it. And one of the things we find here is that the students were really out there to try to protest what they thought was an encroachment on their rights. They were protesting the Cambodian incursion that occurred on April 30th of that year. And the students were there, massed, gathered. They weren't perfect. They were yelling, but they were throwing some stones here and there. But the stones had no way. They're stones. They had no way of reaching the guard. The guard had just been at Lodi, putting down a Teamsters rebellion. They were tired. They were egged on by Governor Rhodes, who, with kind of echoes to 2020, was making taunts about how these were brown shirts, the worst people in America, these students. And they had no reason to believe that the guns were loaded. And the guard never admitted it was wrong. They've never acknowledged that. There was a civil suit that was filed by Alison Krauss' father. It was a Holocaust survivor, and criminal suit, civil suit, criminal suit was put out, was dismissed. The civil suit got them some money, and over the years, Kent has tried to look at the issue. They tried to erect a gym in 1977 that was right on the grounds of the right where the students were. And Michael Schwartz, the president of Cleveland State, having served as Kent State president, in those days he was Kent State president, was told that the Carter White House was just scared to death. It was going to be another incident. They moved the gym barely, but those students, and I've interviewed a lot of them, they were students, they were activists, Ellen Canfora, others who really stood up for a lot of things that were very hard to stand up for over the years. And they got the gym moved a little bit, but over the years, it's a real testament to the power of dissent. I just feel goosebumps as I think about it. They got a monument that was erected there, beautiful monument, kind of like the Vietnam. The Lynn Monument, echoing with what the students were doing, beautiful sayings. They got a national visitors center. And so what I think Kent has done is they've revised history, and they've tried to learn from history, and they've tried to preserve dissent in many, many ways. Now, this of course is past. It's 50 years ago. And one final remark about Kent State, which is that the Kent State actually made some change. Very interesting. After that, historians have looked at what Kent State did. You might say, well, what did Kent State do? And there's at least three things it did. First of all, it led to the protest, which in those days was just unheard of to have 4 students killed. The students were rioting and protesting and exercising their First Amendment right to free assembly all over the country. But that led to Nixon ending the illegal and immoral invasion, it was called, kind of in an Orwellian way, incursion of Cambodia he ended early. The War Powers Act was passed, and and that acted as a curb to further invasions that were not done by congressional approval. And also it led, I think, in one way to the student vote. It was very hard to argue that students and young people who had the foresight and the intelligence and the emotional willpower to protest should not have the same right to exercise there at the voting booth. So in 1970, the students were allowed to vote 18. So that was a legacy. And May 4th remains replete with relevance. The right to protest is enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It stands as a permanent stay in what happened on citizens' right to expression. As political philosophers have long emphasized, representative democracy favors certain perspectives to the exclusion of others. Dissent provides a mechanism for the marginalized, the unpopular victims to get their say in court. As John Stuart Mill famously suggested, it serves as a safeguard against the encroaching state. Well, several days after, about 10 days after Kent State, with all the underpinnings of dissent that I suggested, 2 students were killed at Jackson State. They were protesting a rumor of a civil rights leader that they thought had been killed. It was a false rumor. It was a different event. It was different historically. It was different racially. And of course, it had a lot of different aspects to it. It hasn't gotten quite the same play as Kent did for a number of reasons, and race is probably one of them. But then with Kent State occurring on May 4th, Jackson State, I think around May 20th of 1970, then with a kind of a historical irony, we then had the George Floyd protests occur. And the George Floyd protest, where there were maybe 20 million people who were participating all over the country, every state union, rural, urban, many Americans of different races, by the way, are protesting. And one of the things that's so interesting on this, everybody, is that the majority of Americans, because of the protests, and the violence is complicated, but you can't say the violence, it's very unrepresentative as it was, and you can't say that the sheer outpouring didn't make a difference, because if you look at the polls, 71% of whites acknowledge that racism and discrimination were big problems facing the country. And even attitudes toward Black Lives Matter changed. For the first time ever, a majority of the public supported Black Lives Matter, 52% from 42% a month earlier. And that, by the way, has remained constant. So this has, and a majority of people saying that racism and police brutality are major problems. This is unheard of among the white population, and is, I think, a legacy to what people did. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide there. So the dissent that these individuals did, which was courageous with the pandemic, had an effect. Now, look, dissent is not without complication, as any dissenter will say. In the case of the George Floyd, there's been dissent among dissenters as to where do you go into violence, and by the way, some of the violence was not done by the dissenters. It was done by groups that were from other nationalities and other political agencies, right wing. But look, there's always challenges, and there was in one case. There was a person who tweeted something that said, look, violence has a backlash. You got to be careful with violence because it can lead to Republicans being elected. It was a political science study. That person then was fired from their job. So yeah, there's always problems. But I got to say that's noteworthy. It's important to note that we need to have dissent with the dissenters. But in fairness, that's probably a very small minority of all of the huge amounts of tolerance for dissent among dissenters. One of the issues here that as we think about this today, one of the issues that is important is the modern landscape and the role of technology. How has dissent changed from 1970? There's constancies and there's changes. Technology has always been a part of dissent, from the printing press to rolling off leaflets in the days of the 60s, to technology in the Arab Spring, where technology and Facebook played an enormous role in the Arab Spring, with one of the technology people talking about how he was the face of Egypt and the protests over there leading to thousands of people going into the streets. In Hong Kong, umbrellas were used in some of the Hong Kong protests against the state of the communist China state. And the same umbrellas turned up in Portland, the power of memes. And we also see that, by the way, with the Me Too movement. With the Me Too movement, which was launched after 2 courageous women investigative reporters, Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor from the New York Times, did this phenomenal investigative story, launched because of the power of social media, launched the Me Too movement. By the way, Black Lives Matter, which was launched, the term I think goes back to Trayvon Martin and before, when the term was power social media. So social media can be an amazing force for technology, but technology is not without complications. Technology can be co-opted by government. Government can use technology against dissenters. We've seen that in Egypt. We've seen that against Snowden. We've seen how our own government has used technology to, as Snowden disclosed, to spy on our own people. Finally, as I finish up here, we've got the other aspect of technology today, which changes it. Hate groups. Hate groups and trolls will troll on dissenters. The jobs, not mobs. This was a meme that happened in 2018. They got the idea jobs. Jobs was something that Trump was giving us. He did bring jobs, but then they used the term mobs. Mobs was this pejorative term to describe the supposed people who were protesting, the mobs to describe people who were protesting Brett Kavanaugh. They used that term to describe them as mobs. They used the poetry, jobs, not mobs, has a kind of rhetorical power in poetry. And that was then circulated with a great deal of power over conservative right-wing kinds of websites and allow people to mobilize against the left. So those are the challenges, and there's always challenges. And I think you'll hear other two speakers talk in practical ways that I have nothing but great admiration for about how the fight and it continues. From John Stuart Mill to the 1930s, the 1960s, and RBG with the biography of her called I Dissent are real testimonies to that. You know, and I go back to Kent State. I know whenever I visit Kent State, I'm always a little haunted. I always think about those days in 1970. It always haunts me a little bit. But when I think about the events in a broader context, I will walk across campus with more hope and appreciation, affirming the important role of dissent. Dissent was the cornerstone of Kent State, that it played then and it has to perform in American society today, because whatever our partisan disagreements, dissent is an American virtue. So with that, thank you. I'll turn it over to Melekte, and she'll take a somewhat more contemporary direction.
Thank you all, and Professor Perloff, I appreciate the historical overview and the themes around dissent and justice and solidarity that you pulled throughout. I want to take a step back a little bit more into the 3,000 feet. What are some of the practical applications of knowing your rights and exercising your rights if you are in a protest and it does escalate and you find yourself arrested, or you find yourself potentially a victim of violence or a victim of some of the state-sanctioned violence that happens unfortunately so frequently. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the rights that you need to know in a protest, provide another overview around what to do when you're interacting with law enforcement in that setting, and then finish up with some of the common charges that get brought up for folks who engage in protest and sort of how the institution, again, responds back to protests there. So when we talk about freedom of speech and the First Amendment, we're talking about freedom of speech, the freedom to peacefully assemble, and the right to petition the grievances of the government. And this is separate from civil disobedience. And I want to make that distinction because civil disobedience is defined as nonviolent, unlawful action as a form of protest. So if you engage in civil disobedience, you're not protected under the First Amendment. And I like to say that up front because I think there, at times these things get conflated and folks feel, well, protest is legal. That's true to an extent, but if you're engaging in a specific kind of protest that is blocking traffic, is meant to disturb, is meant to speak to the kind of injustice that you're protesting, there are things that can occur to you, and the government isn't within their legal bounds to do so. Again, as we know, regardless of if it's morally right or not, but it's within the government's bounds to do that. So when we say free speech, can free speech be restricted? So content cannot be restricted, but the government can place restrictions around the time, place, and manner that can be imposed on protests. So usually this looks like the government making restrictions on the place, size, sound, location, so they can constrain your protest or constrain civil disobedience in that way, but they can't stop you from distributing literature, holding signs, organizing chants, engaging people in the public, or again, just protesting what you're trying to protest. So where can protests take place? So public places, As long as demonstrators are not blocking traffic or breaking the law, and permits are required. Sometimes they cost money depending on the size, sound, and the location of events. And can I record law enforcement? Yes, you can in public, but really use your discretion there, because I have seen police smash people's phones, take their phones away, delete their photos and videos. So just so you know, you have the full right to record the police, but doesn't mean that these things won't happen to you. And additionally, any photos and videos that you take can be evidence used against people in the protest, even if it's meant to be helpful, supportive, in solidarity on social media. Be mindful of the ways that agent provocateurs, federal agents who try to identify organizing leaders and try and destabilize movements from within, a lot of the time they're scouring social media to try and collect this data. So just be mindful of that. And of course, some tips to consider before engaging in a protest: make sure you have those important numbers on your arm. Make sure that folks know, who aren't attending the protest, know that you're there, and arrange a check-in time, wearing comfortable shoes, layers, face masks in the form of COVID. Making sure that your phone is in airplane mode, because just as Dr. Perloff lifted before, the police, law enforcement have the ability to collect some of that information. So making sure that you're not connecting to open Wi-Fi networks. And generally, police must obtain a warrant to search your phone, but we suggest setting your phone to a password that's password protected, and not so much the fingertip, because biometrics, a lot of the civil liberties law around that isn't as developed, and a passcode, you can say, I do not give you consent to open my phone. I do not give you this passcode. That's a little bit more firmer in court, and you're more protected in that way. So I'm going to share my screen for the last couple slides of my presentation. This is kind of the meat of it. And I'll send out this PDF, which has a lot of these numbers and a lot of these tips to the group after this presentation. 1 second. All right. So interacting with law enforcement, the only time you must speak to the police to identify yourself is stating your name, address, and date of birth. You don't have to show the police your photo ID during a protest, but keep in mind that you can be arrested for refusing to identify yourself. And if you're being blocked in by a police officer, or they're trying to get you in a corner or square you away, it's most likely that you're going to be detained or arrested. So just be mindful that you can be arrested for refusing to identify yourself in that moment. And again, just use your discretion when interacting with law enforcement, as always suggested. So keep in mind that law enforcement legally can lie to you. You cannot lie to law enforcement, but they are trained in the art of persuasion. They may be asking a lot of coercive leading questions. And probably the best thing to do is not talk to them. You cannot talk your way out of a situation if they're trying to box you and detain you, if it's a mass arrest type situation as a protest. But we always like to say, remain calm and then exercise your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. So what do I do if law enforcement becomes involved, and how do I exercise my right? So one of the most important phrases that I always like to lift up: am I being detained? Because the police need to reasonably believe that you committed a crime to detain you. And if you're being detained when an officer uses force, you're being detained when officers use enough force that you do not feel free to leave. So talking about this boxed-in situation, which we've seen very often at protests before, a police officer asking leading questions or trying to identify a particular protest, or really just try and disrupt the protest. So again, this gets very tricky because the police are very often violating people's rights in those moments. But again, try and remain calm, try and remember as much as you can. And this phrase, am I being detained, holds a lot of power. So again, what do I do if law enforcement becomes even more involved, things are escalating? Saying that I do not consent to a search because the police need consent or a warrant / probable cause, with the exception of patting folks down for weapons. And saying that I want to speak to a lawyer is probably the most important, critical, I would say, magic phrase in this instance. If you're arrested, invoke this right, and the police must stop engaging with you. If you say, I need to speak to a lawyer, I'm going to speak to a lawyer, they must stop engaging with you. They might not, and we lift that up again, but stop engaging with them. So again, I'm going to remain silent and the police can continue to engage. So what do I do if I am arrested? So you have the right to remain silent, but request to speak with a lawyer as soon as possible. Make sure that you stop talking after you invoke that right. And remember that you can make a local phone call, but the police can listen, record, monitor those calls with the exception of your call to your lawyer. And what to expect if I'm arrested. So you're probably going to be processed and booked at the Justice Center. Sometimes, like we saw in Cincinnati during the George Floyd protests, they might arrest folks at a different location or use some sort of temporary facility. You're not required to answer questions during booking, but just keep in mind that if you refuse to say your identity, that may delay the process of getting bail and just the court proceedings in general. Charging decisions can take up to 48 hours if you're arrested on a weekend, or kind of this vague reasonable amount of time. I've seen 4 to 5 days for protests. And this is when, again, the prosecutor is determining the charges for you, and then bail will be set and you'll be able to, potentially get released. There's a number of bail funds and different links that I'm going to put at the end of this presentation for folks who want to donate, and also numbers that you'll need when you need to be bailed out for a protest. And just going over some of the offense levels and punishments in terms of what you would necessarily be charged with. Usually a lot of this stuff is low-level misdemeanors. Probably I see a lot of M4s and M3s that come in with our intake. Depending on what happens during the protests and the level of escalation, people are charged with felonies. And these are some of the common charges that we see: recklessly causing inconvenience or alarm, unreasonable noise, hindering or preventing the movement of persons, blocking the police. So again, these are usual minor misdemeanors, but they can do things like stacking a number of these misdemeanor charges. So your bail ends up being very high, or picking one and making it a low-level felony, which again, may be harder to get out of jail because that's a higher bond amount. So there are many ways that, again, the state is sort of using their own institutional mechanisms to respond back to civil disobedience. And again, just another list of commonly charged crimes: obstructing official business, failure to disperse, riot, or resisting arrest. So I know that I am a couple minutes over, so I want to kick it to Rachael, but keep in mind I'm going to be sending a version of this PowerPoint to everyone, and there's a little bit more details and more tips and information about knowing your rights during protest. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Melekte. And thank you everyone for having me today. I'm Rachael Collyer, again, the program director of the Ohio Student Association. And I've actually been involved with the Ohio Student Association for 8 years. So since I was a student myself back in 2012. OSA has actually been part of, the protest movement since, close to our beginnings. In 2014, John Crawford III was murdered in Beaver Creek, Ohio, and we did the organizing to make sure that the tapes of what had happened were released. We did an 11-mile march from the Walmart where he was murdered by police to the courthouse in Xenia. We occupied the police station there, and while we weren't able to get justice for John Crawford, we were kind of catapulted into a national movement space. And, it was a moment of the whirlwind, so to speak, where the horizon of possibility shifted, and we're going through another moment like that currently. The culture has shifted. What's really important in a movement moment is that there's sort of two schools of organizing thought that you can think of. One is momentum theory of change, and where we see the horizon of political possibility and the horizon of public opinion shift dramatically, as Professor Perloff was referring to, with the changed attitudes around Black Lives Matter and around acknowledging the truth of racism in this country. We're really seeing a huge tectonic shift, and young people have always been at the vanguard of movements, in particular young people of color who have always been the conscience of this country. And so this kind of second theory is the more traditional Alinskyite theory of organizing, which is very much about picking winnable fights and building, incrementally and bringing people into organization. And I think what we have to do is have both. Right now, there's so much potential power out there And what's really important is to harness it into organization and build a container that can hold power in the long term. So we have to kind of capture the energy of this moment, and we need to dream big right now. What's really important, and what, you know, I think is special about the Ohio Student Association and special about this moment is the ability to dream big and dream about the kind of world we want to live in, and set that vision out, especially in this moment where there is such potential for change, and really painting a picture of the world as it could be. And so part of our program as well, we just finished up an artist activist fellowship where we had 8 artists from across Ohio who were creating artwork around this moment, around the world as it could be, around our visions and dreams for the future. Because as Adrienne Marie Brown talks about, really revolutionary imagination is science fiction, and it's, imagining something that we've never seen before. And part of what we try to do is figure out, okay, how do we start moving that way? How do we dream these big dreams and also pick fights that we can win, and harness energy into organization. So we have chapters across the state where we are picking fights on campus and also, in community with other folks. So, I think right now, there's a whole lot of campaigns and exciting work happening. I'm thinking about the Abolish the Overlap campaign that Black Spring Cleveland and Clevelanders for Public Transit are working on. Our case chapter is going to be jumping in to support on that campaign. And I do think there's just such an incredible potential energy in this moment. And so on our end, as OSA, we're really about inviting students into organizing and helping students to learn the craft. I mean, not just students, young people in general, to learn the craft of organizing, so that this protest moment does not just become, another flash in the pan. I mean, I don't think that's the case. As Professor Perloff already said, there really has been this huge cultural change as a result of this moment, as a result of this, this shifting of narratives around what truly keeps us safe, around, what policing actually is, which is, an occupying force, which is, essentially a terror force in particular in poor and Black and brown communities. And let's see how to kind of wrap up, I guess. But yeah, I think what's important is that we give young people the skills to organize in the long term. And this is going to be for many, many people, the equivalent that the 60s was for, Professor Perloff and others, in his generation, that right now is a pivotal moment. And yeah, I'm grateful to be doing organizing work and to be here with you all in this moment. So I'm not sure how long that was, but we'll leave it there for the time being.
I'm going to come on now here for just a moment and suggest that you look for the question and answer button on your screen. So if you're working with a desktop or laptop, it's most likely on the bottom of the screen. If you're using an iPad or smartphone, it could be on the sides or at the top or in the corner, but just look around for question and answer. And then please use that button. I know Wayne Jennings been suggesting that as well. And I'm going to invite our speakers just to have 2 or 3 minute back and forth discussion now, and then we'll do the questions and answers. And you guys ask some questions, and the questions will be directed to our speakers.
So you'd like us to kind of dialogue among ourselves a little bit?
Yeah, talk amongst yourselves.
Okay. Yeah, I think 2 things. One, the comparison of now to the 60s, as Rachel said, is one of the things about the 60s that people don't understand is that most of the students were very, very conservative. And it was as you both know, the people who argue for change are already the people who are the most innovative and the most able to see beyond the current pastures. But most of the people in the 60s most of the students were fairly conservative, with only a very small minority that were active then. And I think there's much more. Having said that, I think there's a base. There's much more teaching students, getting into contact with students. There's much more of a reservoir of support for all sorts of movements. When I talk with students, there's a great deal of open-mindedness to great deal of tolerance, even people who are working class and might, from a demographic perspective, be expected to be cautious. Very much openness to racial issues, a lot of issues on gender. People are very, very tolerant of gender fluidity. So you have a base, I think, to operate on now, which is exciting. One of the things I want to ask you, though, is how do you deal with the tension? I want to talk about defunding police. So how do you deal with the tension between the fact that's a very important cause, and we saw in Minneapolis where there was a great deal of need for that, where that officer, Chauvin, had been, like so many others, the one in Missouri, and of course, Tamir Rice's, two in Tamir Rice's case, one of them had a long record of brutality. And the need for social workers, the need to do things with the fact that people in communities themselves, some African-American communities, don't want to defund the police. How do you deal with that tension in a way that can help us come up with enforcement that can help people's lives live longer? We can prevent some of the brutality that we've seen.
Yeah, so I think that's a super important question, and it comes down to a paradigm shift. And back to sort of this like imagination, it's something people have never seen. We have a single story about what safety means in this country, and it comes down to policing in cages. And what we know from our history, from hundreds of years of more policing and more cages, is that it hasn't made us any safer. And when it comes down to it, what we're really talking about is this. What it really comes down to is, what do we believe makes us safer? And we have this single story. So I was actually just having this conversation with the political education team of Safer Heights. If folks aren't familiar with it, it's a Black youth-led organization that just started back in June, out of this protest movement, which is, exciting to see and be able to support the development of organization coming out of a movement moment. And Safer Heights focuses on defunding the police in Cleveland Heights. And really, I was working with the political education team and kind of going through some training materials that credit to Stephen Johnson Grove, who put those together back during issue 1. But really what it comes down to is we have to understand how, get folks to understand what we're actually talking about when we talk about community safety, and taking folks through so what is our criminal justice system supposed to produce? It's supposed to rehabilitate people, the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. It's supposed to make us safer. But when it comes down to it, the outcomes that we're achieving are people are becoming more traumatized. People aren't actually being rehabilitated, and people are not getting the resources they need to actually become, be able to bring their gifts to their community, to be able to live a life with dignity. And so what it comes down to is that the system of criminal punishment we have is sucking so many resources out of our communities that we have this huge imbalance. And Stephen actually compares it to like a cancerous growth. So if you picture our society and there's, you almost picture it as a body, and there's all these, different organs, and they all need, to function, to make, the community function properly, and for everyone to have what they need to thrive. Now our criminal punishment system is sucking so many of these resources out that the other systems don't want to have what they need to function properly. You think about education, you think about healthcare, so much of our resources as a society are being used to police, to incarcerate, to fight endless wars. When we actually have, in Cleveland, more than half of children live in poverty. It comes down to this fundamental question of we have to tell a story that community safety is more schools, better, access to resources, is every person having the resources they need, food, shelter, safe security. That actually makes us safer. And so when we talk about defunding the police, we're really talking about reinvesting in communities. I mean, not even necessarily the word because many communities have never truly been invested in particular Black communities, in particular, poor communities, just have never seen true investment. And, crime is not I don't believe that humans are just inherently bad or criminal. What it comes down to is that people do not have access to the resources they need to live and to live with dignity. And when we provide that, that's when we're actually going to achieve safety. So it's really about breaking it down to people and getting folks to understand a different idea of safety.
I'd also thank you for that question, Professor. I'd also like to affirm Rachel's reimagining of what public safety would look like. And I also want to lift this piece that she mentioned around the Black community being pro-police, pro-carceral state, and really talk about that agitation, because there's this natural contradiction when the same community is one that has their rights violated most frequently by the state. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a rise of Black thought leaders who were saying, as a response to violent crime in our neighborhoods, we have to invest in law and order policies. That's very clear. I think it's something that we need to bring up when we talk about public safety and when we talk about centering the voices of folks who are most impacted by police violence. We have to talk about the impact of those thought leaders. Those thought leaders were also calling for a fair distribution of funds for education. They were also calling for mental health and addiction treatment for crack, not exclusively, but in lieu of all these other pro-drug policies. Maybe they weren't calling for pro-drug policies at the time, but they were calling for other investments in community that Rachael lifted up that were not being addressed. And the only investment, the only, deepened policy-driven investment that was made was within the carceral state. And when you did that, you took away resources, you took away conceptual labor, you took away people from their communities, put them in cages, imprisoned them for long sentences. And you also didn't address this issue of violent crime, because many of those folks who are often victims of violent crimes themselves, and that hasn't actually addressed or stopped violence within our cities or insecurity that people feel within their cities if our cities are quote unquote less safe. So we haven't, again, addressed the issues that this call for more law and order policies from Black politicians lifted up. And we also haven't addressed the fact that, those same Black thought leaders admitted that they were wrong, but they also admitted that there haven't been real solutions for the Black community on a systemic level. And again, I want to lift up, I don't speak for the Black community. It is not a monolith, but there is kind of these contradictions between radical Black thought leaders, reformists, and we see some of that same agitation surfacing now. And I think we need to do both things. We have to do some radical reimagining, but then we have to have frank conversations about the divisions we've made between violent and nonviolent offenders. We have to talk about the role of police in perpetrating trauma that creates folks who feel like they need to project violence in their community as an outlet to that pain. And we also have to talk about the Black thought leaders back then who lifted up the same things that we're calling for now around education, mental health, community supports for public safety that have still been unanswered, and the political failure that demonstrates that we're still kind of having these same conversations, which is, it seems, much harsher outcomes.
We do have questions and answers, and I think I'd like to thank our speakers thus far, and I know they're going to have more to say as we look at the questions and answers. And so here again, the Q&A button on your screen, look for that. Also, speaking of icons on your screen, look for the chat button. And if you're not already on our list to get updates for future forums, you might want to put your email address there so that we can contact you and let you know about future forums. So the first question to our panelists: what should someone do if they try to vote in person and their right to vote is challenged? Anyone want to take that one?
So I can just quickly drop the ACLU of Ohio Election Protection Hotline. We're watching that hotline. We're going to be watching it nearly 24/7 during this early voting period, as well as the week of voting. But please submit as much thorough information that you can. I'm also going to drop a link to that hotline, but that shouldn't be happening. Again, I would just say I have a right to be here. I have a right to vote. You are violating my right to do so. And I have a right to document this conversation and document the barriers that you've imposed upon me. So let me, feel free to send me an email or, drop me a voicemail around this issue.
Thank you. Next question. What organizations in Cleveland should we join to keep the peace during a contested election if President Trump does not step down, but he's not elected? If it seems clear he's not elected, but he doesn't step down. How can we keep the peace and still protest?
So some of this, I will fully admit, I've been very focused on getting to the election, but there are a lot of people who have been thinking through the contingencies of what do we do if, we end up in a coup, seeing a coup happen. So actually, Keith Wilson has put together a whole document of resources around that. I actually have it pulled up, so I can drop the link to that in the chat if folks want to familiarize themselves. But I think what's most important is to get in an organization. If you aren't already, it matters less which organization than that you are getting organized, because what the best way that we can keep safe, the best way that we can actually protect ourselves and protect our what remains of our democracy is by being organized and by being in organization with other folks, so that we can move quickly and move together. But I will drop that in the chat, and again, credit to Keith Wilson for assembling all of these resources. It's truly, Keith does a lot of public services in that way by collecting and, putting forth information for folks.
This is cool. Our speakers are putting things in chat for us. So that segues into our next question. What local groups can we join to work towards structural change in the prosecution, jail, and court systems? Are there local organizations we can join? Anyone?
Yeah, so the ACLU of Ohio has action teams. It's a grassroots base of organizers and activists convened under shared values and this, idea of an ACLU of Ohio backed policy platform. Right now, we have a group in Northeast Ohio that meets regularly every Thursday at 5 p.m. We're going to be, but you can join even if you can't make those Thursday at 5 p.m. meetings. We're currently engaging in a campaign, a pre-trial campaign that'll help advance more bail reform and more comprehensive bail reform in the state of Ohio. We're also in coalition with the Jail Coalition, Black Lives Matter Cleveland, ITRF Cleveland. There's so many great grassroots organizations that are ready to position us to beat this.
Question. Rachael, you mentioned Saul Alinsky. What other styles of organizing do you employ in organizing around an issue? What other styles?
Yeah, so the two kind of styles that I was mentioning is momentum theory of change, which is much more like based around mass movements and targeting the public, by which I mean targeting the court of public opinion and, trying to create these quote unquote moments of the whirlwind where we shift the horizon of possibility. Alinsky organizing is much more like, traditional, and you target your targets, right? You target decision makers rather than staging a moment that's meant for the public, that's meant to tell a story in the public eye, which, of course you should be doing in traditional organizing campaigns as well. But, we try to incorporate both of those elements and like the understanding that we do need to, have these kind of like touchstone moments where we're telling a story publicly, where we're experiencing mass movement, and we have to, when those moments occur, like we got to move quickly and invite people into organization and pick campaign fights that people can plug into, that can help us move real policy change and create changes in real people's lives. And I also just want to lift up Melekte's incredible leadership on bail reform, on the pretrial campaign that she's working on right now. Definitely go to those meetings if you're around at 5 p.m. on Thursdays. So just wanted to double tap that.
There's 2 or 3 questions that have to do with different ways people can make their views known. And so I'm going to read a couple of these kind of all together and let you guys respond. What are various ways people can support systemic change to reduce, eliminate white supremacy, police violence, and support real ways to keep our communities safe and the humanity of all respected? Like organizations on Facebook, contribute money, show up at organized events, learn leadership skills to contribute meaningful causes. Another questioner said, are individual dissents, like calls to legislators, effective? Or do we really need to get into a larger organized group? And I'll listen to your responses here.
I mean, I'd say all of the above, whatever you can do. Katie LeBlanc, who works at Ohio Voice, she said something that she heard from somebody else, but I won't ever forget her telling this story. And one of the thing that she said was like, pour the coffee, bring the coffee, like whatever it is, even if it's just helping to set up or tear down or bring the coffee to the meeting. At this point, obviously there's not a whole lot of in-person things, but whatever little piece that you can do, we need everyone in this movement, and we need everyone's skills, whatever skills you have. We need folks to bring the coffee. We need folks to, help with the finances. We need folks to do the accounting. We need folks to do the, work, medic work at actions and protests. We need people to create the signs. And yeah, get in an organization. If you're in Cleveland Heights, I definitely encourage you to check out Safer Heights on Facebook and give us a like. We put out calls for the community. We're doing phone banks around the school levy every Thursday leading up to the election. Really just get into organization, and calls to legislators do help. They don't get very many calls, from talking to folks who are legislative aides, like it does make a difference, and calling is much better than emailing. So making that phone call is, especially when it comes down to local electeds, like it makes a huge difference because, for instance, and I live in Cleveland Heights, the Cleveland Heights council meetings, almost nobody ever goes, right? So like now all of a sudden that Safer Heights is trying to have at least one member there every week. That is making a big difference because they're just very unused to people participating, and doing the hard work of just like showing up to, kind of a boring meeting once a week, right? But somebody doing that does have an impact.
I think this question is directed to Dr. Perloff, and others may want to weigh in. So it's very interesting. It gets to the term protest and looking at that. So Dr. Perloff, the questioner says, referred to the term mobs as negative. I believe the word protest may also have negative connotation for some. Is there a better term which can be used to initiate collaborative change? I believe words and language are important. How did the term protest come to be used to describe peaceful assemblies seeking to establish collaboration and dialogue? How did it get to be called protest? Do you want to address that, Dr. Perloff?
That is a great point that I think raises questions for rhetoric, for both what I do in my scholarship and what Melekte and Rachael do. I think that goes down to the idea that protest may to some have a negative connotation. And I think perhaps there's a way of using other terms if you're trying to bring people in. Assembly, freedom, terms that resonate with people. I don't know that protest has a negative connotation at all. I think for some people it has a very positive connotation. I think, what I think might have a better connotation though is the word dissent. Dissent has a real kind of Jeffersonian view. It takes people back to the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution. And, you try to use rhetoric as much as you can. I think dissent is a better way. Who can be against dissent? Well, probably some people in America are, but even the people who stormed Michigan against Governor Whitmer, which was out of touch with public health, they were dissenters, so they probably would like the word dissent. Of course, they would not like the kind of dissent that we think is necessary. That's a better way of looking at it. I think the terminology is important. I think that's where that, and this goes back to the police issue a little bit. I think on the one hand, I think people observe this, the Black Lives Matter slogan was brilliant. You have a verb, a matter. It's just so simple in its elegance. This is where, I think Melekte may want to think about this. I don't know, the defund the police, I'm being a little like, gadfly here. I'm with you philosophically. Just as far as the questioner, I don't know that rhetorically that's the best. You may disagree, and that's fine. Because I think what happens is, on the one hand, you have what that tends to do is it tends to allow people to define the term in a way that misses the kind of point you're saying. Defund the police sort of suggests to people, we're going to get rid of police and we're going to have nobody on the streets, which, as you said, isn't true. And I guess from what Rachel is doing, there's a limit to, you have to always blend your words with what you're doing. You can't always try to please all the people all the time. Having said that, I will just say, I don't think that's the best term. I wish you could come up with, not you personally, I wish we could come up with, as the listener, as the questioner is saying really well, to some degree, a more collaborative term that might allow for more bringing in of groups, like the Me Too movement. If you look at those terms, it's such a great term, Me Too. It's like, me is not the term we usually think of. Me Too kind of allows people to think about it in the colloquial way. So, defund the police. Is there a better way of doing it? Just kind of, and again, I think words do matter. And to the extent that you can call on those things, it's important. And so those are some thoughts I've had more from a communication perspective.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
We're
Did you
both like,
respond?
no. I was just going to say investing in communities, I think, is sort of the other side of the coin when we talk about defunding the police, is talking about the proactive measure of what are we doing with the money? Like, what is the intended action? And the intention is to invest in communities. Go ahead, Melekte. That's all I would.
Yeah, no, totally. I want to go back to this question around, is protest a triggering word? I don't think protest in and of itself is a triggering word, because it's simply a declaration of an objection to something and a statement that we are seeking a resolution. And I think it's less so the word per se, but how protest has been framed by the media. Because as we know that this kind of news coverage is fundamental to protest's viability, but very oftentimes the media delegitimizes protests, the use of passive and active positioning of even the way they say protesters clash with police, even saying something like that, when it's truly police clash with peaceful protesters. And there's a lot of great research. I want to lift up the research of Professor Brian Adamson at Case Western Reserve, who does a ton of linguistic research around protest media coverage and the hierarchy of this social struggle, because we all know that, white women who are able to protest police violence has been able to get legitimate coverage. It's been able to add a compassionate angle to usually, heteronormative, this kind of institutional perception of what a protest is. So we say people are triggered by the use of the word protest, but we've conditioned violence, we've conditioned delegitimacy around protest and Black protest in itself. And we can pull out examples of the differences between nonviolent white protests and nonviolent Black protests and the state responses to it. So I think not necessarily taking out the word protest, but really unpacking what are the implications that we've had around Black and white protests, older people protesting versus white people or younger people protesting, kind of the respectability politics of protest in itself. Because for folks who haven't been exposed to certain kind of organizing methods or haven't been exposed to organizing spaces before, protest will come out as outrage. It'll come out as trauma. It'll come out as fear. And then from there, we've already lifted up that the association of violence and riots to protest delegitimizes the public consciousness around the cause. So there are so many constraints that we need to lift up. But if we're getting to a place of there's a certain way that protest needs to look and it needs to look this way, we're already siding with the institutions. We're already siding with the folks who have power to change the policies that are directly impacting the people who feel like they have to be unlawful to be heard. So, I don't want to be trivial around this conversation because it's one that needs to be had, but I want us to speak to why is protest triggering to some and why is riot attached to civil disobedience? And I think that is the conversation I want to have.
It's interesting you mentioned the media, because I have a couple questions that were emailed and they relate to the media, and I'll ask them both at once. How can protests about racism keep getting good media attention? Does the public get tired of the same story day after day? And then related, how supportive are media in covering protests? Does it depend on the popularity of the subject matter? In general, which provides the best coverage? TV, newspaper coverage? How does social media fit in?
I think I'll throw one small thing in there, and then Professor Perloff and Melekte, feel free to jump in. One, I'm not like a media expert or anything of that nature. I've written a lot of press advisories and press releases over the years, but I'm certainly no expert in that. But I think something that I like say a lot of the time, to folks that I'm coaching or during trainings, is that we have to repeat the same message over and over and over again until we get sick of hearing it, because like we have to actually kind of infiltrate the zeitgeist, right? So, it doesn't matter if we're tired of saying it. I will give that speech about community safety over and over again until I'm sick of saying it. Like, and that's what we have to do to start to actually like shift the narrative. So getting that coverage is really important. And Melekte just like really went straight to the heart of it too, with like, it comes down to ethical journalism. It comes down to us being really, on point and information with our messaging, like, and having clear messaging and repeating it over and over and over again, and making sure all of our leaders are trained on it, making sure spokespeople are trained on it, and that they're repeating that message. And that, we're coordinated in that way. So I just wanted to add that, but anybody else want to pick up or add anything?
I just have to say, Melekte, that was the best answer I've ever heard. That was like brilliant. I mean, that really covered everything. I mean, you really hit to the heart like a doctoral dissertation. And that was really just amazing. Thank you. And thank you for clarifying it. We know a lot about how media cover things. Traditionally, the media have looked, you're right, at kind of pitting one group against the other. My colleague Todd Gitlin was argued for that in the 60s, that the media would tend to frame the protests of the 60s as violent. To some degree, that was true. I think in the history of protest coverage, research has found, as the questioner is saying, that the media do make a difference. They tend in general, and there's an important exception to this, to frame it as one side against the other, which tends to look for dualities. They tend, as a great point, even raising the question of protest suggests that it delegitimizes it. They tend to look at they tend to focus more on the violence. They tend not to look at causes and underlying causes. The George Floyd thing was an exception to that, in the sense that they did largely focus on the fact that when there's a great deal of public opinion support for something, the media will follow the public opinion. Since there's a lot of public opinion support for it, they gave a lot of support for that. Now, the violence made it more complicated. They did cover the violence. Some of the violence, I think, was correct. There was violence in places like Portland. On the other hand, the media news probably played it out of proportion. The thing that the questioner needs to remember, though, is that the media are very, very fragmented. A lot of it plays to the partisanship of today. When you look at Fox News, you will get extremely biased, prejudiced, very, very white supremacist type coverage at its worst, and you won't even hear the grievances. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans hear that. And what Trump has been doing is some of the ads against Biden has been priming kind of classic kind of racist tropes that go back to Nixon in the 60s. And so that's always a danger. Social media I think social media is, in general, can play a great role, because what it can do is it can bring these kind of moments to people, and it can show people. I mean, people get news. We don't get, Facebook doesn't cover things. There's not a Facebook news team, but they bring news that's been gathered by journalists, and people will get news and links and posts, and to some degree, social media can bring moments to people. I think it's the job of organizers probably to clarify and to explain and to help people understand what these moments mean. I think the meaning is important, so people understand that there's more to just the George Floyd thing than going out and protesting. There's much more to it. So it is a continued work in a society where media is so important. It's a continued work to help people understand, to get back to what the questioner asked, and Melekte said, is the importance of framing protest, not in a defensive way, but in a way that really upholds its fundamental verities.
I'm going to ask a couple of more questions before we end today, and I'll put two together, which have to do with the police. There's a comment here by one questioner: Safer Heights is a good example of community activism. Are there others that are taking on the police other than Black Lives Matter? There's another question. How can you keep police accountable to be sure their actions are not inflammatory? A couple questions about the police.
Well, there's also Black Spring Cleveland, which is working with Clevelanders for public transit. I don't think I fully explained, when I brought it up prior, but they're working to abolish the overlap and remove transit police, given the Groves decision several years ago that, they cannot really, basically just getting rid of this overlap because there's not very much that there's nothing that these transit police are doing aside from like harassing people around their fares, and we're paying for a whole, essentially additional police department. So that's definitely, one campaign to pay attention to, check out Clevelanders for Public Transit and Black Spring Cleveland. And I think on the question around like police and holding them accountable, really like it's very difficult to do that given the way like that, the police union functions. One of the things we're looking at in Safer Heights is the union contract is going to be negotiated for the police starting, I believe, in like January or February, since it expires at the end of March. So one of what we're doing now on our end is starting to like go through that with a fine-tooth comb, getting the help of unions, union folks to understand what we're looking at and try to figure out, okay, what's our policy platform? How do we build a campaign to really figure out what can be changed to actually create some measures of accountability? What needs to be altered? Because so often like these police union contracts really protect police. The city is the one that's footing the bill and by obviously taxpayers are footing the bill when police do commit misconduct. We're paying these giant settlements, and they should have to have private insurance. If they knew that they were going to be responsible for footing the bill, or if there was any sense that they would actually have consequences, police might be more careful around being, not just inflammatory, but around like harming people or, I was at the George Floyd protest and saw the police really like start what happened. Like the police started that. They were, I had to watch my little sister, dodging tear gas. Like there was it was 100% the police treating people, as if they were like an invading force, right? Like it was chilling to watch. But I think what really it comes down to as well is solidarity and, numbers, and us really ensuring that, especially those of us who have white privilege, making sure that we, let police know that we're watching, because police are definitely going to treat white people differently than they're going to treat Black folks. And it's just the reality. And, as Melekte was pointing out, like with respectability politics and the respectability of protests, I think, something to ensure is that like always using your white privilege to ensure that, because police are going to much less likely to hurt you or to, commit violence towards another person if you're watching, if you're putting your body in, on the line to ensure that police can't harm somebody, because they're going to try and hurt Black people 9 times out of 10 before they ever try to hurt a white person, especially a white person that they perceive to be more respectable. So
I think this is a good last question. And
actually, sorry, Laura, do you mind that if I respond very briefly on some action items? So supporting some of the groups that Rachael mentioned, Black Spring Cleveland, BLM Cleveland, supporting the ACLU action team, supporting all criminal justice reform, not even just specifically police reform, because police have major discretion around bail. And, if we have bail reform, police officers will be giving tickets for some of these low-level offenses instead of, detaining and arresting them. When we talk about drug policy reform, the same thing. Police have a role in every single aspect of criminal justice reform that we're pushing. So learn about those issues and how they all intersect within the carceral system. Another thing that I want to bring up, I'd be remiss to not bring up the Just Society proposal led by Ethan Corona and Madison Maynard and the Minorities Together movement. Just heads up for some folks in Shaker who aren't aware, there was a series of amazing, well-organized protests to push for more enhanced police accountability in Shaker. That was never even introduced after 3 or 4 months of well-attended protests, of a petition that has 1,000+ signatories. So your own mayor and your own city council is sitting on very tangible, very common sense measures to try and hold our police officers accountable. A lot of that proposal comes from the 8 Can't Wait national movement that bans chokeholds and provides more de-escalation training. So just keep in mind, everybody who's a Shaker constituent, there's something that you can do right now to contribute to that movement. And also just stay aware of all of the movements that are happening in Cleveland on social media, on Facebook. I know there's a lot going on, but all of us try to support one another. So, if you stay kind of tuned into the landscape, you'll know when we need you to call or send an email or write a letter, and other direct action opportunities.
Thank you. And so I think this is a good question to end on, the last question. And it starts with a comment to Rachael. You mentioned joining any one of the many groups organizing around an issue. So the question is for all three of you, and I'd ask that we have the responses kind of brief. Is there any effort to unite all organizations to collaborate together around issues?
Yeah, there's a lot of, efforts at collaboration. I think, there also has to be, an ecology and a multiplicity of organizations that are, taking different angles and that have different theories of change. It's important that we have a healthy movement ecology. But there, Avery Martins is definitely one person who, makes every effort to get folks on the same page and help to kind of align people, because oftentimes we end up like siloing or not realizing that there's other folks working on the same thing. So that's part of the role of an organizer, and that's why training people in organizing and building relationships is so important, so that we can be in solidarity, so that nobody is sort of like reinventing the wheel, and that we can support one another's efforts and collaborate where possible. So
there's definitely efforts around the police, the defund police movement in Cleveland, but I want to lift up too that if you want to make the most impact on police violence and police brutality, you have to be looking at the municipal level, because your mayor and your city council people have the most power in terms of who am I proximate to actually change systems. Because yes, we can have some statewide bill that bans chokeholds for all police officers in the state of Ohio, but that'll be nearly impossible to push within our state house. And then when we think about enforcement, again, it just comes down to that municipal level. So be cognizant of the fact that there are tons of police reform campaigns that are happening right now. You can Google Movement for Black Lives and come up with a policy agenda and an organizing toolkit. But keep in mind that the organizing that you want to see that's going to have the most impact is going to be right up close to you. It's going to be your city council person. It's going to be your mayor. If you want to look at things regionally, for Cuyahoga County, we have our sheriff, but then he refers to the municipal law enforcement offices. So again, trying to push in that municipal level is probably the most important.
And if you live in a city where there's not one yet, I'm going to drop my contact information in the chat, and I'm happy to help you kind of, support you in thinking through how you might get organized. It's important that I just want to, again, double tap, like Melekte is so brilliant and is so right on the importance of focusing at the municipal level and focusing where we have the most power and where we can enact the most change. So again, if you don't live in Cleveland Heights, it sounds like there's, organizing happening in Shaker Heights, in the city of Cleveland. If you live in another community, maybe you can help get something started, or there may already be folks starting to talk about this. So get connected with them. But always here as a resource if anyone wants to talk organizing.
I would just add to that I think that you cannot underestimate the power of police unions. Police unions have a great impact. They look, police are there doing good things for the community people wouldn't do, but police unions have in many cases been forces against change. And so it is a challenge to try to work with it. The politics are, the laws are generally structured so they protect the elites, and the power of unions, police unions, has been a real deterrent to change. So I think that there are probably two approaches here. One is that you try to work on the level as what Rachael and Melekte are saying about the get to know your people in Shaker. The other is to work on a grassroots organizing level. I think that there is no easy answer to fight back on the police unions when it comes to those issues. But perhaps the best answer, the most optimistic answer, is the kind of thing we saw with the George Floyd protests, where the outpouring of people, of young people, parents, children, led to a kind of a sea change. So it's not an easy thing to fight, but there's reasons to be optimistic.
Thank you to all three of our speakers. You just did an excellent job with this topic. I want to mention that next Sunday, we have a wonderful forum. If you have a brochure, you might notice that November 1 was left blank or to be announced. And so the reason was to see if we had something that was going to come up that seemed very pertinent. And we do. A contested presidential election, what's at stake? That's the title of next week's forum. The November election is happening against a backdrop of unprecedented social, political, economic challenges. Early winners cannot be announced in all states, since approximately 40% of absentee ballots will not be counted till election day, and probably during election day. If the incumbent president or other candidates prematurely announce a victory, will the Supreme Court or House of Representatives intervene and declare a winner? What might happen if the authority of the Constitution is not unilaterally recognized and accepted in this election? And we're happy to have with us Jonathan Inton, law professor emeritus at Case Western University, as our speaker. Also, I want to invite you to attend our service, which is happening very soon in just a few minutes. Go to uucleveland.com and follow the prompts to enter that service. And Wayne, do you have anything else to say today?
No, not really, but except thank you to everybody. Very terrific presentation, and we hope to revisit this topic again in the near future, and hopefully there will be some progress that we can report. Anyway, thank you. We will conclude our forum today and hope to see you all next Sunday. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.